Hello again everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I am joined by a special friend that we haven't seen in a while, and that is this guy right here, the Pinebook Pro. This is one of my favorite laptops actually. I've done a few videos on it already. It's just been a while since I've had the opportunity to record content about the Pinebook Pro, and I definitely wanted to get back to it, and I'm doing that today in today's video. And what we're actually going to work on is find out how we can work around the big weakness of the Pinebook, because as great as this laptop is, it only has 4 gigs of RAM. And if you are browsing the internet, for example, you can utilize a good majority of that 4 gigs of RAM very easily. But with the Raspberry Pi, which now has up to 8 gigs of RAM, we can actually benefit from the added resources of the new Pi by offloading some of the work from the Pinebook Pro over to the Raspberry Pi, and the two together can actually be a very powerful combination. So let's go ahead and dive back into the Pinebook Pro and see how we can utilize a Raspberry Pi to offset the memory limitation. Alright, so here I am on the Pinebook Pro. Let's go ahead and get started. Now the first example I'm going to show you guys is how to run a Firefox session that is actually being hosted on the Raspberry Pi, but is shown on the screen of the Pinebook Pro. So if I open up a terminal here, and what I'm going to do is enter free-m, and as we can see, we are very limited on memory right here. We only have about 4 gigabytes available. And let's go ahead and set this up. So the first thing we want to be able to do is be able to SSH into the Raspberry Pi. We just want to make sure that we're able to do that because that is a prerequisite of what we're about to do next. So on my end, I actually have a host name already for my Raspberry Pi. So if I do SSH, and I actually call mine dev, D-E-V, just like that. It's my dev server, my test Pi, if you will. I'll press enter, then I'll say yes here. Now you might be prompted for the password, and that's totally fine. I use SSH keys with a passphrase, so that's why you are seeing the output that you're seeing right now. And now I have an SSH session open to my Raspberry Pi. And as we can see right here, I have a Raspberry Pi 4, and I have on this Pi actually 8 gigs of RAM, so basically twice the amount of RAM that's on the Pinebook Pro. And I'm not actually using that much because we can see right here I have over 7 gigs of RAM that's not being used. Also, just so you're aware, I'm actually running Ubuntu on the Raspberry Pi. Now you can also do this with Raspberry Pi OS as well. There's only one slight difference, which I'll get to in a moment. Now on the Raspberry Pi, since we're already connected, let's go ahead and get it set up. So the first thing you want to do, sudo apt update, just to make sure that the repository index is completely up to date. And I do have 39 packages that need to be updated. It's probably a good idea to keep that up to date, but I'll be fine without that in my case. There's nothing substantial that needs to be updated. I'm going to set up the X2Go server on the Raspberry Pi, and to do that, well, we need a few packages. So sudo apt install X2Go server and X2Go server X session, just like that. So basically we are installing the X2Go server package and also the X2Go server X session package as well, but don't press enter just yet. We also want to add this option right here, --no -install -recommends. And if you don't do this, it's going to install a bunch of packages that you really don't need. And that's especially true on the Raspberry Pi because we want to keep that as slim as we can. And also, don't worry about manually typing everything out. If you'd prefer to copy and paste the commands, you will actually find a link in the description below to the Wiki article for this video that will have all the commands in there that I am executing in today's session. So I'll press enter. And there's going to be some packages and some libraries as well. I'll press enter to go ahead and start the process. And there we go. So next, let's go ahead and install Firefox to use as our example. And the package name will differ depending on if you are using Ubuntu or Raspberry Pi OS. But essentially, we will run sudo apt install. And if you are running on Raspberry Pi OS, the package name will be Firefox-ESR. But if you are running on Ubuntu, the package name will simply be Firefox. So I'll press enter, then enter again. And there we are. Everything was installed. So we should be all set when it comes to the Raspberry Pi. So what I'm going to do is hold Control and press D to disconnect from the Raspberry Pi itself. And from here, we're going to go ahead and work off of the Pinebook Pro. Now what we need to do is go ahead and install the X2Go client. And in my case, I'm actually running Manjaro. If you're running something else, you might need to adjust the commands accordingly, but let's go ahead and search for the package first and make sure that it's available. And on Manjaro, we could do that by running pacman -S lowercase s. Then I will type X2Go and press enter. And we can see that the X2Go client is available. Here it is right here. And the package name should be the same if you are running something like Debian on your Pinebook Pro. It should work just fine. So in my case, I'm going to run sudo pacman -syy to go ahead and update the repository index. And if you are running on Debian or Ubuntu, it's sudo apt update, as I showed you on the Pi earlier. And then also, if you are on Debian or Ubuntu on the Pinebook, then it's simply sudo apt install X2Go client, just like that. But since I'm on Manjaro, I'm actually going to change that to sudo pacman -S X2Go client, as you see right here. I'll press enter, enter again. And that was pretty easy, that was quick. But before we go any further, we want to make sure that we don't have Firefox running on the Pinebook at all. Here's the Firefox icon right here. In my case, I've customized this a bit, so it might look different for you, but I don't have Firefox running. We don't actually see it down here. If you want to be double sure of that, you could do ps aux and then grep for Firefox. And I don't have any results beyond the grep command itself. Firefox is definitely not running. And the reason why that's important is because if it is running, regardless of if you go through X2Go to launch Firefox, it's still going to use the resources of your Pinebook. We want to make sure that Firefox is not running at all. So now we can go ahead and go to Applications and then Internet, and we should see the X2Go client right here. I'll click on it. And since this is the very first time that we have used this utility right here, we need to go ahead and set up a profile. So I'm going to call mine simply Raspberry Pi. Now for the host, we can actually type the DNS name of the Raspberry Pi or the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. If you have DNS set up and you have a name on the Pi and it's recognized, that's better. That's preferred, so I will type mine in right here, dev.home-network.io. But if you don't have DNS set up, you can add the IP address of the Pi right here, and that's totally fine. Then you want to go ahead and type in the username that you have set up on the Pi. Now, if you are running Raspberry Pi OS, that could be just simply Pi for the username. If you are running Ubuntu on the Pi, that could be Ubuntu as the username. But for me, I actually created a user for myself by the name of Jay, so that's why I'm putting that there. The SSH port we can leave at 22 unless you changed it for some reason. And then next, where it says KDE right here, we want to drop this down and choose the option Published Applications, because I'm not wanting to run a desktop environment. I want to run only a specific application that is on the Pi to save resources. So I'll click OK. And then that adds the session here on the right. So now if I click on it, We get prompted for the password of the Raspberry Pi, so I'll put that in. Click OK. And right now it's connecting and it's running. And basically everything is working just fine. And it might not be immediately apparent what you have to do to go ahead and run an application. But what you can do is right here, we have this little circle icon. We can click on that. And what we get is a list of applications that we have installed on the Raspberry Pi. So if I drop down network right here, we have Firefox on the list because we went ahead and installed it. I'll click start. Might take a moment for it to initially come up on the screen. And as we can see right here, we are running Firefox. Now, if I open up a terminal, I'll just enlarge the font a bit here. I'm on the Pinebook. I haven't used SSH to connect to any other machine. I can do ps aux and then pipe to grep. We want to search for Firefox in the process table. It's not listed. So I'm running Firefox, but on the Pinebook, I used ps aux to search the process table for Firefox, and this doesn't count because this is the actual grep command right here. Firefox is not actually running. Now, if I was to use SSH and go into the Raspberry Pi itself, and repeat the same exercise, you can see that Firefox is actually running on the Pi. But what's cool about this is that I have essentially forwarded the Firefox application to be shown on the screen of the Pinebook rather than the Raspberry Pi, which actually, in my case, doesn't even have a display on it at all. So now I can go ahead and browse the internet using Firefox that's running on the Raspberry Pi, and it's not going to go ahead and use the resources of the local machine. It will use a bit of resources. That's okay, but the majority of the memory usage and the CPU and everything is actually going to be on the Raspberry Pi itself. So now I can actually browse the internet with 8 gigs of RAM available, which is more than the Pinebook itself has. Now, something to keep in mind is that if you are wanting to, watch videos like YouTube videos and things like that in the Firefox window, your results might vary. There might be lag, there could be some slowdown. It might work just fine, who knows? But other than watching video, it actually should be a relatively decent experience. There might be some lag and page loading and things like that, but it shouldn't be all that bad. And we now have 8 gigs of RAM to use for browsing, which is way more than we had available to us before. But anyway, as you can see right here, we have Firefox running, and we have 8 gigs of RAM on the Raspberry Pi, in my case, to benefit from. And that takes a little bit of load off the Pinebook Pro, which is pretty cool. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and give you guys another example of an interesting trick that you can do with the Raspberry Pi and the Pinebook Pro. So again, I'm going to go ahead and open up a terminal window here. And what I want to do is go ahead and install Mosh, which is a really cool way of keeping a terminal session alive and restoring connections when connections are dropped. And the value of this is going to become more apparent when I actually show you the example. So let's go ahead and get into it. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open another tab here, because we need to set this up on both the Pinebook and the Raspberry Pi. So in this tab, I will just SSH into the Raspberry Pi. Again, mine is named dev. And there we are. So for this, I will need to run sudo apt install mosh, just like that. Press enter. And I must have already installed this in the past and totally forgot about it, but it's already installed. So I'm all set on the Raspberry Pi. Now, whether you are using Ubuntu or Raspberry Pi OS, the command should not be different. Sudo apt install mosh, just like that. And then over here on the Pinebook, we need to go ahead and install Mosh here. So for that, we will run sudo pacman -S then Mosh, then enter. Then we'll type in the password. And, you know, I must have already done this in the past and totally forgot about it because it's already installed on here as well, but you get the idea. The command is simply sudo pacman-S mosh here on the Pinebook because I'm running Manjaro. But if you're running Debian or Ubuntu on your Pinebook, you'll use the same command as we used on the Pi, which is sudo apt install mosh, as you saw earlier. So we should be good to go for this part right here. So now I shouldn't need this tab actually. I will disconnect from here. Now we're basically ready to begin, but there's one thing that we want to do first, and that is to make sure that ports 60,000 through 61,000 are allowed on the Raspberry Pi, because we need to connect through those ports in order to actually use Mosh. So I'm going to go ahead and SSH into dev my Raspberry Pi. And in my case, I am using UFW. Now, if you have a different firewall in place, either a hardware device or a software firewall, you need to allow 60,000 through 61,000. So what I'm going to do first, in my case, because I'm using UFW on the Pi, sudo UFW status. We can see that I have quite a few ports here allowed, but I am not allowing the ports that are necessary for Mosh to work. So to fix that, I can run this command right here, sudo UFW allow 60,000 :61,000 /UDP, just like this, and then enter. And the role was added, and now I can disconnect from the Pi. Anyway, let's go ahead and get this show on the road. So now you're wondering, okay, so what's so great about Mosh? Why should I care about this? Why is this awesome? Let's go ahead and see it in action. So normally to SSH into the Raspberry Pi, as I've done several times so far, it's just SSH, then either the host name or the IP address. You already know that. But what I can do instead is change SSH to Mosh and connect this way. So I'll press enter. And it is using SSH for the initial connection. So I'll go ahead and type in my passphrase. And now I am connected to the Raspberry Pi via Mosh. And so far, nothing looks different here. This looks like your standard SSH connection. And if that's what you think, you'd actually be incorrect. So what I'm going to do is just show you guys an example here. I will just run htop and press enter. And now htop is running on the Raspberry Pi. And it doesn't really matter what app you have running. We just need something to illustrate the example. So now what I'm going to do is go over here to where I see the Wi-Fi icon, and I'm going to disconnect from Wi-Fi. So now I am disconnected. It says the network is unreachable. Now let's just say I was working on a script, writing some code, doing some work. I forgot to save it. Wi-Fi dropped out. Something bad happened. I lost the connection. And with SSH, you can actually lose everything you're working on in that scenario, but not with Mosh. So I'll go up here, and I will connect back to Wi-Fi. Give it a moment to connect. Connection established. And now my terminal window, check this out, is restored. htop is working again. It automatically reconnected me to my Raspberry Pi where my work is being staged. So in this scenario, you can actually use the Raspberry Pi to get your coding done, to do some work. You have more RAM. It's kind of a more powerful machine. So you stage your work on the Raspberry Pi, and if something happens, for example, like I mentioned, your Wi-Fi drops, then that's not really a big deal because it'll reconnect. And another thing that you can do is you can actually take your Pinebook outside of your house. Maybe go to a client, go to a friend's house, whatever it is you're up to. Then you take your laptop back home or back to your office, connect back to Wi-Fi again, and then you'll be reconnected to your terminal window just like you never left, and everything you're working on will be right there back on your screen again. And that's what Mosh allows you to do. It allows you to restore your session and continue where you left off, even if you disconnect from the network and reconnect later. And that's pretty awesome. Now for me, I actually use the Raspberry Pi, this device right here, for basically everything I do on my network. So if I go into my Git directory here, You can see that I have quite a few repository directories downloaded here, like my Ansible configuration, some Kubernetes things, some Nagios configs. You get the idea. I even have my notes here. So this Raspberry Pi is actually pretty important to me. I mainly want to keep connected to this thing because everything I'm working on is all right here. And the reason why I like that is because I can have a tmux session opened, and I have a whole tutorial series on tmux, so I'm not going to get into what tmux is here. It just enhances your workflow. And you see here I'm running tmux. I might have all of my work happening in tmux. I can actually resume tmux from any computer in the house. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even have to be the same computer. I basically have tmux sessions running on the Raspberry Pi. So my Raspberry Pi is like the central place where all of my work, all of my in-progress things are happening. And I basically connect to it, disconnect from it, reconnect to it. Anytime I want to get back to what I'm working on, everything stays running on the Pi. So even if my laptop runs out of battery, again, it doesn't matter. I go to another computer, and then I connect to the Raspberry Pi, restore my tmux session, and I'm good to go. And Mosh makes that all that much better because, again, I can just go ahead and disconnect. Then I'll see this message up here that basically says the network is unreachable and is telling me how long it's been since I was able to connect. Then when the network is restored, then I'm back to what I'm working on. And there you go. My session is restored. So I like using a Raspberry Pi with the Pinebook because I can basically offload things that I'm working on right onto the Raspberry Pi. I can even run a Firefox session on the Raspberry Pi as well. And all of a sudden, the memory constraints of the Pinebook Pro, it doesn't really matter anymore because I have a lot more resources at my disposal, and that's pretty cool. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope you found this useful, and maybe you have even found other ways that you can utilize a Raspberry Pi with your Pinebook. I think it makes an awesome combination. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and make sure you click that like button if you want to see more Pinebook Pro content. And go ahead and subscribe because I have some awesome videos coming very soon. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.